In the last presentation, I touched on the relationship between what are seen as classical economic theorists such as Smith, Burke in his own way, Hume, Locke, um, Hegel, the dialectic of history, and then how Karl Marx, who represents what we call the left wing of the liberal Enlightenment tradition, drew from both Smith and Hegel and then articulated um, a political economy in which the idea was that if history unfolded dialectically, as Hegel and Marx thought it would be for different reasons, of course, the new world would be brought into being on which poverty and sickness and illness would forever be dealt with in terms of what people had lived with. What I'd like to touch on this time, and I may just add, if you could see the TED Talk by Shadia Drury, very important for you as we move into the final exam season. Shadia Drury, her talk called Socratic Mischief, How Human Civilization Went Astray. So Shadia Drury, it touches a lot on the classical thought, how Hegel appropriated that classical thought, and the problems with Hegelian thought as it plays into imperial tendencies, particularly aspects of the United States. So it's a nice 16-minute overview of understanding how Hegel can be appropriated by the left, as Marx appropriated him, how Hegel can be appropriated by the right, by empires, by imperial traditions, and how Hegel can also be interpreted in a humanist tradition as well. There's multiple ways of reading Hegel. But so if you could read Shadia or watch Shadia Drury's TED Talk, Socratic Mischief, How Human Civilization Went Astray. It's January 14th, 2019. It's about 17 minutes. So I think that would be important to again see the ongoing relevance of Hegelian thought, Hegel being one of the probably most prominent and preeminent philosophers of history, and he's constantly accessed today to justify, if depending where you're coming from, a certain perspective, or he's also seen as the great apologist for liberal modernity. George Grant, the great Canadian philosopher, said there's only two preeminent philosophers in history. One is Hegel, who's the great defender in a subtle and sophisticated way of the modern liberal project, and Plato, who would be the great defender of a classical heritage, and the tensions between Plato and Hegel. For those who delve deeper into it, you can certainly see most clearly in the implications of that. What I'd like to do in this presentation is look at the difference between what we would call High Toryism as a political tradition, and then blue conservatism. And often, sometimes Toryism and conservatism are equated, which they are not. They come from two different historic traditions. I want to briefly touch on that, and then by way of conclusion, I'll look at the relevance of that for contemporary Canadian political life, because we study history not as an archaeological project. We want to understand, in terms of thinking through these great ideas, what's the relationship between the past and the present. There's always the danger of people can get so immersed in the past that they're not asking what's the relevance of it to the present, or some people can be so immersed in the present that they forget about the wisdom of the past, which is probably in many ways our dilemma. The cultural virus of memoricide is our problem, in which most people today really have no understanding of the great works of literature, the women and men of the past, how they thought through the notions of the good and meaning and identity and purpose and all of these things. So it leaves them bereft when it comes to understanding notions of human identity, the best way to think publicly, politically, communally, all of these things. But let me just touch briefly on, and I have in the course already lingered for some time on these thinkers, but the difference between historic High Toryism and that of blue conservatism. So as I've gone through the course a little bit, and part of your the midterm question lingered a little bit with such thinkers as Erasmus, Thomas More, Richard Hooker, all key 16th century thinkers. I can moving forward in Hugo Grotius, for example, Jonathan Swift, and then the High Romantics, which I have mentioned in the course outline, particularly the three High Romantics of England. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, and Robert Southey, and you can move forward into certainly the English tradition through Disraeli, William Morris, Ruskin. There's a whole range of thinkers here, but what underlies, so there's a family tree here, a line and a lineage here, which we would call High Toryism, and it had a huge impact, obviously, on the founding of Canada. Sir John A. Macdonald was a contemporary of Disraeli. Three or four things to mention here which differentiate it from what we would call conservatism. Um, One is the important connection between the individual and the living community and the past. So High Toryism recognizes, in an older Christian sense, of the communion of the saints, but we are connected to those who have gone before. We receive what they have given us, and it is our responsibility to pass on the torch to those who go after us. So there's this organic connection between the past, the present, and the future. Burke once said, democracy is the voice of the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. So it's not just our generation, our people, our time, but we carry the past with us. We internalize it. We try and live it, think it in our time, and then we are responsible for passing it on to others. And so at a philosophical level, it has an understanding of past, present, future, which is highly integrated. We're not isolated atoms in our own period of time, disconnected from past, present, and future, but we're part of a movement of history, and we have a few little moments in times, like the Bede's sparrow in the monastery tower, and then we fly off, and others come flutter, as it were, into the bell tower. So that would be the first thing, and so there is, in this sense, there is a wisdom in the past that we ignore to our peril. Certain elements of liberalism, with its notion of the Enlightenment, progressive notions of history, tend to have a dimmer view of the past and what it can contribute to the present and the future. So very different understandings of history. One is there's great wisdom in the past we ignore to our peril, culturally, personally. The second would be a very high view of the state. In that sense. So the state and society play a very important role in bringing the common good, or the English tradition, the common weal. So in the French tradition, the Catholic just means cataholis. We're a part of a greater whole. The English tradition of the common good, the common weal, even the First Nations traditions in that sense, they're a part of a historic community, knit and connected to one another. And so it is the role, in that sense, of the state as well as society to work together for the common good. Now, the state can become totalitarian. In that sense, it needs the corrective of society, but society itself can become fragmented, and particularly in a commodity culture such as ours, a transitory age such as ours, the notion that somehow society is going to save civilization, as certain right-of-center conservatives think, is a bit naive. And so High Tories saw a very, very close connection to the role of the state, and it being intervening in the economy, providing basic social goods for one and all. Hence, taxes are a little higher, and of course you get this element worked out in certain European countries. Affordable health care, education, many other things like this. A third element would be within this High Tory tradition, they were way ahead of our time, almost like canaries in the proverbial mine shaft, of seeing the ecological issues that were emerging. So the High Tory English poets, Coleridge, Southey, Wordsworth, they were acutely aware, because England was seen as the workshop of the world, and northern England, Manchester, Birmingham, places like these were places that the emphasis on profit and loss were central to this, but the pollution that was emerging in this part of England and the way workers were treated, this was appalling to the high Tory writers who in the Lake District were in one sense. And the slavery, Coleridge was one of the great critics of slavery, and as the slaves came through Bristol and England, and he and Wordsworth were hunted down by comparable to the CIA of their time. So they were ecological philosophers grounded in a religious tradition, a communal tradition, a historic tradition, and the state had a very important role in limiting the power of the entrepreneur in terms of the treatment of the land, the soil, the people, and also the working class people. This is why you often had in England, interestingly enough, there was a merging between the upper class, the high Tory, and the working class against the middle entrepreneurial class. Because the high Tories had a strong sense that the entrepreneurial class had no solid ethical foundation. The ledger of profit and loss was what shaped, guided them, and their treatment of the working class, the treatment of the land itself, was just an item to exploit for their own prosperity. And so high Toryism, in that sense, always subordinates economics to ethics, virtues to values, contemplation to action, because it realizes when this gets inverted, when this pyramid becomes distorted, there are serious implications. As I mentioned in my last presentation, really the key figures in conservatism are people like Locke and Smith. I touched on Burke. Interesting for those who are interested in reflecting more fully on Burke as a conservative, to compare Burke, for example, to Coleridge and Southey and Wordsworth, or Erasmus and More, or Hooker, who are the real older Tories. And you'll see that Burke, even our great Canadian public philosopher Macpherson, he clearly situates Burke in the context of the emerging liberalism of Locke, Smith, and Hume, and people like that. So when we hear conservatism today, the first thing we have to ask is, what is being conserved? Is it a high view of the state, the role of state and society in protecting the common good, the role of the past in relationship to the present and the future, the responsibility of citizens, the state and society to protect the ecological environment, ecology, environment, and social concerns, a triangle that had to be held together? Or is it about prioritizing? Is it about prioritizing the economic sphere, which, interestingly enough, this is what conservatives in that Lockean Smithian tradition share with Marx, is that economics is a key, whereas in the high Tory ethics is foundational, as is the contemplative. The other is a very activist tradition coming out of the Protestant work ethic, in which doing, performing, accomplishing, defining identities by what we our performance, our accomplishments. The other is there's something deeper in human identity than merely the performing, the acting, the persona self. There are depths, deep religious depths, deep contemplative depths that cannot be measured, reduced to facts and statistics and numbers in a certain narrow scientific sense. So important to understand then, when we think of the founding of Canada, it really, Confederation, obviously 1867, but there's important philosophical notions at work in this. And Canada's roots are a blend, unlike the United States in that sense, which foundations were much more liberal, Puritans coming over, the Mayflower, Plymouth Rock, people turning against, cutting away from certain Tory elements of the European tradition. Obviously, as I mentioned in a previous talk, people like Locke and Burke are foundation to the founding of the United States. So it's not that they divorced themselves from the European, but they only drew from a certain period of history in the European experiment in that sense. And they brought that period, 16th, 17th, 18th century, of the entrepreneurial individual over to the forming of the United States. And this is why the United States, for example, a great suspicion of the state and the power of the individual. And the only reason the state exists is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so high funding for policing, because one way you can use your liberty is through crime within. And of course, great funding for the military, because your life can be lost from invasions from out, or particularly your many interests around the world, whether oil or prosperity in that way. Canada never weaned itself in the same way as the United States did from an older tradition in Europe. As I mentioned earlier, we have discussed Erasmus more, Hooker, can move forward, and mentioned Grotius, who, even though Dutch, came to England, spent a lot of time. Swift. So the tension in Canada, unlike the United States, is between what Gad Howritz in his interaction with George Grant calls the Tory touch. We always have had this older Tory element, and out of that, for example, in Canada, we have universal health care, national broadcasting system, the CBC, greater emphasis on public education, not as much on privatization of education. So we have in Canada this history of the positive role of the state, not just in political, civil, and legal rights, but also in the area of social, economic, cultural, environmental rights as well. It's a much more integrated understanding of the common good in that sense. And so we have two traditions here. One had a very important role in the founding of the United States and continues those ideals, even though maybe the names of the thinkers have disappeared from history for those who have no sense of history. But the ideals continue, of the preeminence of the individual, a lighter view of, in terms of federal government, entrepreneurial system, lighter taxes, the competition of individuals. And so these key thinkers that were foundational to the United States are very much within that liberal heritage. Canada does not come from that tradition alone. We obviously do have that element in Canada, but in fact, the older high Tory tradition, this also religiously can be explained if you understand the different forms of Christianity that came to the United States and came to Canada. The United States had a significant impact from the Puritans, or forms of Protestantism, which was turned against the state, turns against historic Christianity, and it set forward to create a new state, a new religion, a new Jerusalem. Whereas Canada's tradition religiously was much more Roman Catholic and Anglican, and these two traditions have much greater sense of the common good, of history, of the common weal, and the role of the state in ensuring and guaranteeing that one and all have access to these sources and resources. And so Canada and the United States, we're a much more complex heritage in Canada. We have this Tory touch, or what we would call high Toryism, back of the language of red Toryism, which Gad Howritz used in referring to George Grant after the publication of his 1965 Lament for a Nation. And so if we move from history then forward, if we can see that there are two traditions going by the name of conservatism. One is really liberal. So they're trying to conserve what we consider second generation liberalism, post-Reformation, the world of Locke and Burke and Smith and Hume, and moving forward. And then, of course, social liberalism of Mill and Rousseau and people like, which we've been looking at in the course, and Karl Marx, more to the left, obviously, of Rousseau and Mill. These are variations of liberalism, but there's a much older tradition that Canada also had absorbed in its founder, and it still lingers in different ways. And that's the high Tory tradition. You find that in George Grant and Stephen Leacock and Donald Creighton, John A. Macdonald. There's a whole range of thinkers who embody this particular heritage. And so past and present, why is Canada different from the United States? We have different founding genetic codes, or DNAs, which distinguish us, and we never weaned ourselves from that older intellectual heritage, that European heritage. And so we're caught in that sense. Canada is somewhere torn between being drawn into the gravitational field of the United States, but also resisting it because of a much deeper, perhaps stronger rooting in the European, the Anglo-European heritage, we have also internalized. So we never severed that umbilical cord. And so in understanding the difference between High Toryism, which is really a much older form of what is to be conserved, and what is called by conservatism, which is really a form of liberalism, we can see how the United States went in one direction with this and why Canada is distinctively different in that sense. So if you can heed these two brief reflections, and also, if possible, watch, as I mentioned earlier, Shadia Drury's Socratic Mischief, How Human Civilization Went Astray, TED Talk, January 14th, 2019. It's about 17 minutes.